Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I would like to thank you for joining us for the 7th installment of our 2021 Summer Survivor Speakers Series. Today, you will hear from Mr. Max Glauben, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, who went on to help found the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, the precursor of today's museum. Max was born in Warsaw, in Poland, in 1928. In late 1940, Max, his parents, and his younger brother Henryk were confined to the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest of the ghettos created by the Nazis during World War II and the Holocaust. In May 1943, after the Nazis savagely crushed the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Max and his family were deported to Majdanek death camp. There, Max's mother and younger brother were murdered. Max survived several concentration camps and was ultimately liberated by members of Patton's Third Army on a death march to Flossenburg concentration camp. Max eventually settled here in Dallas, Texas, where he lives today with his wife Frida and their extended family. Before we begin, I would like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivor Speakers Series: Cristo Rey Dallas, Jewish Family Services of Greater Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Refugee Services of Texas, and Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. We are grateful for all of your support. Your support makes this program possible, so thank you. Max will share his story with you today, and then we will have time for questions and answers. So he'll speak for about 45 or 50 minutes. To ask Max a question, please click on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen and type in your questions. And now I give you Max.
Good afternoon, and to all the listeners and viewers, I'm glad that you took time to listen to a story of a Holocaust survivor who decided to devote a lot of time to creating a beacon that will teach people of how to make this a better world. I was born in Warsaw, Poland, to a middle-class family. My father was a member of a family that were in the newspaper business. My grandfather owned a Jewish publication called The Express, and my father was involved with another Jewish publication called Das Jüdische Tagblatt, the daily Jewish newspaper. Both of them were distributed through Europe and not printed on the Sabbath, because that was the day that was our Sabbath and we're not supposed to work or do anything. I lived a very nice life and nice quarters with my family. In our close family, there was my dad, my mom, and my little brother that was about 2 years younger than I was. My father's name was Isaac. My mother's name was Fela or Feiga. I was named Maniek, and my little brother was Henryk. September 1st, without any warning, Germany invades Poland with a new type of warfare, blitzkrieg. Evidently, they have an agreement with Russia and simultaneously the two invade Poland. Germany, Western Poland, Russia, Eastern Poland. By October, the city that I was born in, which was Warsaw, is occupied by both of them, and mainly by the Germans. But also on the political side, Germany and Russia signed non-aggression pact that they would not invade themselves and keep the territories that they've captured. But this doesn't happen because a year later, Germany invades Russia and gets stuck in Stalingrad. And I'm going to quit there because by that time, Germany started really enforcing the law of the final solution. The war that I called as Blitzkrieg was done by extreme bombing and then having the armed forces occupy the territory. Needless to say, within 1 month's time, 85% of structures in Western Poland, including Warsaw, were destroyed. The ones that might have had anything to do with Jewishness were bombed a little more, and they knew where they were and how they were. Thus, life changed where one had to start living under horrible conditions that could not provide sufficient items that were necessary for a regular life. The stores that we dealt with were bombed, thus you couldn't purchase any food necessary for survival. If you bomb the buildings, electricity, gas, and other utilities are either cut off or unable to sufficiently supply everywhere. Water is the most important product for survival, would also be available in scarce apartments. Thus, we had to drink water that was gathered in barrels under the drains that were collecting it, or the heavenly side was in the wintertime, and it was the winter times when Warsaw was occupied, we could collect that in pots and pans and live on the water that we collected after blocking off the bathtub or maybe the sinks and collecting snow in it, which was a commodity that really helped in life. This was how our lives changed immediately from normal life to the worst kind of life that you can imagine. But on the other way, when the Germans get in to Warsaw and occupy it, if you were a Jewish person, you had to register under false pretenses that if you register and answer all the questions, it would improve your lifestyle. By that I mean you'll be able to obtain jobs and maybe food, rationing better. But it was a big lie, because later on in 1942 and 43, it was a way of knowing where we were and what we had, and a way of helping them how to gather us or find us and put it for destruction into certain camps that people were being sent on boxcars. And the two places that people have been sent from Warsaw was Treblinka and Majdanek. If you were a Jewish person and if you registered, and if you had someplace where you could live, it was fine. If you had a job, it was no longer a job. If you were Jewish and worked in a non-Jewish factory or shop. If you were an attorney, a doctor, a professional person, you could not practice your profession to the public at large, but somehow through the black market, or maybe in basements or in your own home, practice these professions. Immediately before the end of the year, the Germans selected a 1 square mile next to the Jewish cemetery and decided that that area was going to be a Jewish ghetto. A ghetto consisted of a place where is surrounded by a wall with, at that time, they planned like 20-some exits and entrances, which were guarded by Germans, and they would place all the Jews in that 1 square mile area so they could do with them whatever they wanted. The building of the ghetto starts at the end of 1939, and it is finished in 1940. Because of the hygienic and a way of life situations, that one area becomes a horror place. Any imaginable disease known to mankind occurs within 1 year. A typhoid epidemic occurs. And while the Germans were inside that area conducting observance of how the ghetto was built, they abandoned that because they fearing that the Germans would get typhoid. Thus, they created a city council consisted of high echelon educated Jewish people and maybe religious people, and made them get 2,000 volunteers to be a police force that we later called capos to do the dirty work for the Germans. Needless to say, it's finished at the end of 1940. The build walls are built by Jews that lived in that 1 square mile area, possibly with funds that they robbed from us in the ghetto right after the war, because we couldn't own any property. And what it meant that we not only built the wall, but we also paid for the wall to close us in like prisoners, or maybe people that are undesirable to live or mix into society. When it was finished, the Germans had the registration, and any Jewish person that lived outside that 1 square mile area was forcefully, or some of them maybe went voluntarily, placed into that 1 square mile area, only being able to take with them what they could carry on their person. Now consider, it's wintertime and there are 4 seasons. So what can you take with you that'll accommodate you for the whole year? And that was not so good. And that was a mystery. And sometimes when we are forced to do something in a hurry, our minds cannot work properly to really get the right things. In that 1 square mile area, there were 2,400 apartments. At random, the people were being forced into the ghetto and placed in apartments. Then daily in the morning, each apartment house was called into its center, because the apartments were built in a square and a free place in the middle with a joint trash or box and hanging lines for laundry and for other accommodations of everybody. Now, we did have restrooms in the place. By the time all the people were placed in the ghetto, each room had between 6 and 7 people, which means an apartment that consisted of maybe 1 room and a half or 2 rooms and a kitchen had maybe 20 inhabitants, so they become like dungeons, and cleanliness was unavailable, food was unavailable, so people were disappearing, and there were not enough people sometimes to take the bodies out of the apartments to the cemetery. So some of the rooms were unlivable. Not the rooms, the people that lived there lived under conditions that were very hard to sustain life. Everything goes bad if you were a Jewish person and you you could obtain a ration and go to a commissary that was run by the Germans and distributed the food and consistently had to hide. So the Jewish couples, or after the situation changed and some of the Germans would come in to the ghetto and try to catch us, if you were lucky enough to stay in a line to obtain the food, which was 84 calories a day per person, and you were not picked up by the Germans, taken to a place that people were being taken to, a gathering place called the Umschlagplatz, and then loaded on boxcars, at least 100 on a boxcar, and then taken on trips that lasted not only the period that they should, like 2 or 3 hours, but they lasted as long as sometimes 5 or 6 days, hoping that the people would perish before they would go to one of the death camps, where they usually gassed them and then cremated their bodies because there were too many to bury. We live under these conditions 1941, 42, 43. By that time, there were very few of us left, and the war for the Germans isn't too good. They are suffering on the front lines in Africa, and they stop in Stalingrad. So my feelings and everybody's feelings was that before they start losing the war, they better get rid of the Jews. So they enforced the final solution. Up to 5,000 daily are taken from the Warsaw Ghetto, placed on boxcars, and taken to Treblinka and Majdanek. We are trying to hide like everybody else, and we use the basements that we used originally for bomb shelters. We use them as hiding places by camouflaging them, and many of them were in the ruins. When the 5,000 people come to basically first Treblinka, the capacity of the ovens and the camps to kill that many people are not that great. So what they do, they put them into the barracks, which are in horrible shape, and then they don't have enough personnel to guard them. Thus, some of the people from Warsaw escape, and they escape back to Warsaw, warn the underground of what is happening to them, that you're being taken to places that have ovens that burn your body and gas chambers that kill you. So then the underground enforces their recruitment of youngsters between 18 and 25, and they create squads. Thus, on April 19, they see some enforcements or German tanks and artillery and military equipment outside the Warsaw Ghetto, and also see a new general, General Strump, and thus an uprising occurs. We are hiding in the basements, and the uprising starts on the 19th, but the youngsters are placed by more than one squad at each of the gates. And I might say that at the beginning, the ghetto was big, a 1 square mile, and had about 24 or 25 gates. But because of the laws of the humans, and the Germans and the capos didn't want to have to look to too many places, it was reduced to 15 gates. So they had enough people at the 15 gates to keep the Germans out of the Warsaw Ghetto. The most heroic fighting by young men and young ladies, ages 18 to 25. And the Germans cannot penetrate the gates, even with the tanks and the equipment. So what the general does is bring in a company or two of napalm flamethrower companies, and he burns the ghetto completely. Anybody above ground that was hiding becomes a casualty. The rubbish falls on the basements that we are hiding in and creates grave sites. Lucky that we, my family and I, are hiding behind a bake oven that had more bricks and more protection from the heat. And after a while, when it cooled off, the Germans would walk with dogs and listening devices and try to listen for life. And if they did, they would throw in a hand grenade and create an opening where they could take the people out to the Umschlagplatz and continue the transportation of human beings that didn't do anything for the journey of death. Around May, we hear an explosion. The people that are pretty close to the wall, of course, are gone. But then some of us that are in the back of the basement are taken out by the German, placed on a boxcar. The boxcar is just placed on tracks without any platform. Thus, it has a 4x8 plywood sheet, and there are strips of wood nailed to it. So if one goes up on there and he might want to slide back, he could not, because there are about 2 or 3 slide stoppers that would stop us from going in. And of course, the procedure was not a nice way of getting us to the boxcars, but finally the boxcars are closed. There's nothing to sustain life or to sustain utilities on that boxcar. The doors are closed and the journey starts. But the problem is that the trip should only take 2 hours, but it takes 5 days because the Jewish boxcars and trains are placed on sidings to allow the regular train schedules to maintain the timing. The 5th day, we land in a place where I could see through there are 2 small windows in the boxcar, either with prison bars or some of them that the bars were destroyed and there's barbed wire around so nobody could escape. And I see the name of Lublin, Poland, and Majdanek is a sub of Lublin. So while I was in Lublin for a short period of time, I thought that I really was, while I was in Majdanek, I really thought that I was in Lublin. We were offloaded not in an orderly order, but mind you, there were many casualties on the boxcar. So you had a hard time getting out and the bodies were left there. And if you jumped off and broke a leg or a bone, you never could survive because they finished you off. Then the able bodies were marched to a place where we were lined up in a military manner, 5 abreast, both men, women, and children, and waited for about I don't know of how long, but waited for the Germans to set up a checkpoints with requisitions to determine who would go to the gas chambers and who was in a good shape or available for them to be placed in a German factory to do slave labor for whatever they needed. I might say that the offloading was about 1.5 kilometers from the camp. So we had to march 1.5 kilometers after we got orders from the Germans. And the orders were, women and children fall out. My mom, my little brother next to her, and my family was in front of us. Behind in the next row was my father and I, and also other members of my family. So when this order was given, everybody in front of us started being wheeled out and only the man remained. And I was considered a child because I was about 11 years old or 12. So I started after my mom and my brother. And by that time, my father grabbed my hand and said, stay with me. And the Germans allowed it because I was as tall as my father at the age of 12. My father was immediately, as we were marching, selected for a work camp, and we were taken to Buzin, the worst camp that I was in. The food in that camp was a slice of bread a day and a bowl of soup a day. If you could gather a container that you can keep the soup, and sometimes you had to put it in an article that maybe was given to you like a hat to eat out of the hat because you couldn't get a container to eat the soup. We would gather every morning to be counted on a place that was called the Appel Square. And mind you, this is 3,000 or 4,000 people. And in the middle, there's empty space, but next to the barracks are the people lined up 5 abreast with a head of that barracks, and he is the official counter. Then they report to the head of the camp. His name was Obershard. Anyways, I got a moment. Fikes was the guy's name. Obershar Führer Fikes. He would come out on a white horse, and not when he was supposed to when we were called out, but whenever he felt like it, regardless what the weather elements were there. And then after the count was finished, he would go to the back of all the groups of people and single out with a whip some and destroy them in front of everybody, stating that if we don't behave and do what we are supposed to do or being told by them, we would end up in the same matter. My father and I were assigned to that Buzin, and that was a camp that was next to an aeroplane factory. And we would walk. We were assigned to a shop in a factory that was employed by civilians, either Polish, German, or Plattdeutsch, which means the Plattdeutsch was somebody that's Polish and married to a German. So we were lucky in that term because the situation where we were working were a little bit better than maybe outside under the elements all the time. And maybe the temperature where we were working was much better. So we were assigned sections that we were working in, and the carpenter section in the airplane factory was there where we were assigned. I was a youngster, and my father was assigned to that, but he didn't know anything about carpentry, so they had him do odd jobs in the factory. We would, after we were counted, we would march in sections to the factory, and that was a long march. We had to sing, and we didn't sing, we would never reach the destination. In the evening, we would take the same route and do the same thing. While we were going, they took a head count of the group. While we were returning, they took a head count of the group. 3 weeks into that camp, we come back after marching in the morning on a Friday evening, and we supposedly are 3 people short. Why were we short? Because we couldn't go to the bathroom when we wanted to, only where we were told to, and there were outhouses that we were using. And also, we didn't eat when we were hungry, but only when they gave us food. So 3 people were left in the bathroom, and because we were 3 short on a head count, not on the original count, they took 30 hostages, 10 hostages for each short person, laid them on the ground, and God knows what they did to him in the night after pushing us in to the barracks. When I got up in the morning, Saturday morning, on the space where my father and other victims were only their shoes left. So the only way that I knew that my father was gone is by seeing his shoes. I didn't give him satisfaction, so I maintained life and did what I had to do in order to sustain life so they wouldn't kill me. I became a pattern maker for the Messerschmitt and the Heikel. These were German airplanes. And because I was good enough in doing that, I was transferred from Budzin to Mielec, then Wieliczka, then Flossenburg. But before Flossenburg, the Budzin, Mielec, and Wieliczka were closed. So they put us on boxcars to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The tracks were full of boxcars with human beings waiting to be destroyed. So they took us to Plaszow, then to Flossenburg, where I stayed till April 16, 1945. I was then called out on April the 16th, on that date, as a Jew and placed in boxcars and left Flossenburg. When we reached the sister or brother city of Flossenburg, Floss, we were shot up by Allied planes, and most of us were killed, and the ones that remained after 3 shootings went on a dead march from Flossenburg to Dachau. After marching from the 16th to the 23rd, being in a place New Kirtzen Balbini, we were placed on a hill surrounded with machine guns and told to stay there. Heard a noise in the town other than aircraft, and 8 of us decided to test our ability to run down from the hill past the machine guns. And when we did this, the machine guns were abandoned and we were liberated by the US Army. We knocked on the Germans' doors and we yelled for the people of the hill to come down, that we were liberated. We tried to get into the German homes to obtain food, and unsuccessfully, They wouldn't let us in except one lady got in, but we were told to start looking for a displaced person camp that would accommodate our lives. So we would get some food and some shelter and clothing. My story has to come in an end because I reached my limit here. So I'll tell you that we were on the road, then we were picked up by a nice Jewish lieutenant with a 179 signal repair company of the US Army, who told us to be quiet, and he told us that we couldn't reach a camp even if we tried to in the conditions that we were. And he says, be quiet and tell everybody that they would tell that we were their helpers. We settled with them in Nuremberg, Germany. So I lived in Nuremberg from 1945 till 47 with the US Army in the caserne that was abandoned by the Germans. I was there during the trials. Then in 47, I realized that I could get passage to the United States by applying with a US committee, US Children Committee. Thus, I succeeded. I was placed in an UNRWA children's orphanage in Aglasterhausen, Germany. And sometimes October, September, the Americans found some babies, brought them to the orphanage, and I was asked to escort the babies to the council in Stuttgart. When I got there, the council looked at the group with the babies, says, I want this group in the United States right away. So immediately I was allowed to be brought to the United States legally on an old converted ship, USS Marine Flasher, from Bremenhaven, Germany. I arrived in New York on December 13th. I was placed in an orphanage. I didn't like it, so I asked to be sent to another town. I was sent to a foster home in Atlanta, Georgia. From there, I registered for the draft in 1948, and I was drafted into the United States Army, brought to Fort Hood, Texas, got my training, would come into Dallas, where I met my wife, and I was relieved of duty in 2 years, 1953. And I had to serve 3 years more as an inactive reserve. When I got out in 53 and I didn't have too much outside because I was an orphan, I decided to marry my wife, Frida Gappelberg, and thank God I've been married still till today. I just had my 60th anniversary. I was able to have 3 children, 2 males and 1 female. I have 7 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. By the US Army liberating 1 person, they created a new world that would replace the 6 million that perished. So now I have over 20-some people in my family that is my new family that could not replace, but it makes it much better for me to have family and to know what families is. And for them, in order to make this a better world, to become upstanders. And that's what they are, and that's what I am.
Thank you so much, Max, as always, for sharing your story. We do have some questions coming in from the audience today. The first question is, did any of your extended family survive the Holocaust?
There are two phases of this. One of my uncles went to Israel when Zionism started. So he was paired up with a young lady, and then they were giving marriage certificates, and went to Palestine then, because that's the only way that the British would let him in to Israel, that is now Israel. So I have family from him and a real large family. He was trying to find me, but because I was with the army, he couldn't find me, or he offered to take me to Israel and support me and give me life. But two of my father's sisters survived the Holocaust. They went to Majdanek. Then they were taken to a munition factory and worked and survived the Holocaust. But because I wasn't registered in too many places, because I was with the army, where incidentally I learned how to speak English and how to drive and all that, and I was well nourished, they couldn't find me until 1985. Two of my aunts found me right here in the United States, and it was all over the world, news. And that's my immediate family. But out of these two aunts, I have family again, because she had 3 children. So it all multiplied by descendants.
A little bit of a domino effect. We have a question from John, who has read The Upstander, the book that Jory wrote about your story. And John says, sorry, I'm going to adjust so my mic sounds a little better. You talk in the book about forgiving the people who, your captors, the people who took the lives of your mother and brother. And he's wondering, how were you able to forgive? And what advice would you give to others who are looking to forgive people who have done them wrong?
Well, you know, there are many bad people that do things to us, and there's anti-Semitism and all that. I don't know how my father died. I don't know who killed my mother other than an oven, other than a gas chamber and an oven. So if I want to take revenge, then I cannot do it, because I don't know with whom to take the revenge. And back, just because they were members of a certain country, I hope whoever asked the question understand this. Now consider this. There is such a thing as self-defense, and there's such a thing as serving in the army. When you become a soldier, you're fighting for your country. So there's shooting involved and killing involved. And sometimes you don't know who you kill, but you're doing it for revenge that he doesn't let you exist. But if I would not forgive for this and had bitterness in me and have to do the same thing they did to me, to the people that I think have done bad things to me, like to the Germans or to the things, wouldn't I become one of them that killed my family? I hope you understand what I'm making. So my action to somebody to take care of what has been done to my family makes me the same as the people that made bad to my family. And I don't want to do that.
Thank you, Max. Sort of a two-part question. Is your wife, Frida, a survivor? And when you came to Dallas, were you able to find a community of other survivors who would get together? Was it helpful to have that kind of community here?
My wife is not a survivor, but she was one of the young ladies that provided entertainment for soldiers that would come in from Fort Hood, Texas on the weekends. And that's how I met her. And I met her in the home of a dear friend of mine that allowed me to stay there while I was coming in there. Now, when I was coming in, originally, there were not too many survivors, and we were like treated like orphans. You know, nobody knew you, and as far as money, we didn't have. But thank God that there were enough, and we got together, and we are the ones that started the spark about this museum. And the Texas Jewish Post even ran an article where my wife was involved in some of the, whether she was a secretary or whatever, and the group, the original group that started this. But you know, when we started, our expectation was on a lower level because we were on a lower level. But it wasn't until we suggested that we get it out of the lower level of the Jewish Community Center and taken into downtown Dallas. So the problem that the Holocaust was not a Jewish problem. It was a humane problem. And we need to involve humanity, all sorts of people. And we need to educate them, because only through education we can make this a better world and eliminate hatred, bigotry, and some of the things that we shouldn't be doing to each other, because we all possess the goodness that we could distribute a little bit better.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on today, Max. Thank you, as always, for sharing your story. Thank you, everyone, for watching with us today. We do have one more session of our Summer Survivor Speaker Series next Tuesday, August 10th with Miss Maggie First. So we hope you'll join us for that. But otherwise, we'll see you soon, and everyone have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
And the one thing I might say, that in our religion, if you save one person, it's the same if you saved a whole world. And I saved myself, and maybe my lecturing has saved many other lives. So I feel pretty good.
Thank you, Max.
And thank you for listening.